Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. So the 6th of August marked the 81st anniversary of the Hiroshima atomic bombing. And as usual, Japan held its annual round of memorial events. But every single time I see headlines talking about the Japanese people as a whole sincerely remembering the Second World War, I can't help but roll my eyes. You turn on the news and there they are, solemn faces, bowed heads, mouths moving about never again and peace forever, acting like they've spent decades in deep remorse. But if you actually step away from the carefully staged camera angles and look at what's happening on Japanese social media, it's a completely different story. Every year, without fail, there's this predictable, almost ritualistic performance where they twist the whole anniversary into a demand for other people to apologize, especially the ones they think owe them the most. And the closer that country's historical involvement is to theirs, the louder they scream. As an American, I find this absolutely infuriating because we're the ones they're really performing for. We're the ones who dropped the bomb. We're the ones who ended the war. And we're the ones they keep trying to guilt trip year after year after year. And honestly, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of the moral posturing. I'm sick of the selective memory. And I'm sick of watching a country that committed some of the worst atrocities of the 20th century try to paint itself as the ultimate victim. Let's start with the Japanese government. They absolutely love inviting American officials to those memorial ceremonies. Back in 2010, when the US ambassador to Japan attended for the very first time, Tokyo was practically doing backflips. The cameras practically glued themselves to the ambassador and every other Western face in the VIP section, as if their mere presence was some kind of tacit admission of guilt. They treated it like a trophy, like they'd finally gotten one over on us. A solemn day of remembrance turned into a victory parade. A classic case of what we might call celebrating a funeral, but here's the beautiful irony that really gets me as an American. With President Trump constantly hammering Japan on trade imbalances, tariff disputes, and defense cost sharing, and with him bringing up Pearl Harbor every chance he gets, which I absolutely respect him for. US ambassadors have flat out refused to attend either the Hiroshima or Nagasaki ceremonies for the last couple of years running. And you should see the reaction, panic, confusion, and a whole lot of hurt feelings. Because let's be brutally honest here, a huge chunk of these elaborate, tear-soaked ceremonies is basically performative crying for the American papa to come and pat them on the head. Well, this time, no pat came, just a cold, dismissive slap across the face. And you know what? From where I sit, that's exactly what they deserve. They want to play the victim while simultaneously refusing to fully own their own history. No thanks. We're not buying it anymore. We've seen the footage. We've read the history books. We know what their military did in Nanking, in Bataan, in Singapore. And we're not about to let them rewrite that story just because they can stage a good tearjerker on television. Japanese netizens went absolutely nuclear online. Pun intended, one conservative lawmaker, after coming back from the Hiroshima event, complained bitterly that nobody at the venue even dared to mention that it was America that dropped the bomb. He whined that Japan did absolutely nothing wrong and just got nuked for no good reason. But then, and this is the best part, within hours, he backpedaled so fast, you'd think he was running a 100-meter dash. He scrambled to clarify that he wasn't blaming the United States, he just thought people shouldn't avoid history, because ignoring the truth is deception. A conservative Japanese politician, one of the very people whose party has been whitewashing war crimes for decades. Lecturing us on not avoiding history, that's not just ironic, that's flat out comedic gold. And from my American perspective, it's also deeply insulting because we know exactly what their imperial forces did to our boys in the Pacific. We remember Bataan, we remember Corregidor, we remember the POW camps where our soldiers were starved, beaten, and worked to death. We remember the death march, we remember the beheadings, we remember the medical experiments, and now they want us to apologize. Give me a break. If anyone should be apologizing, it's the people who started a war of aggression and then refused to surrender until 2 cities had to be incinerated to make them stop. Then you've got the far-right fringe, the true believers, the ones who make the mainstream conservatives look moderate. They look at the memorial inscription that says Japan shall not repeat the evil of war, and they go into a full-blown hissy fit. They call it an American-imposed narrative. As if Japan is being unfairly framed as the villain of the story, they label it a masochistic, self-flagellating view of history that no true Japanese patriot should accept. Some of them actually ask in complete seriousness, why should we call the day we got bombed Peace Memorial Day? Another guy flat out declares, I will never forgive America ever. And then there's the real gem, one genius actually proclaimed, "Next time we go to war with the world, we absolutely must not lose." Oh, excellent. I love that spirit. If that's your attitude, then I say go all the way this time. Fight to the very last man. No surrender, no retreat, no saving face by giving up early. Let's see how that works out for you. As an American, I can tell you right now, we're not the same country we were in 1941, and we're certainly not the same country we were in 1945. We've got far more reach, far more precision, and far less patience for this kind of nonsense. If they want to play that game again, they'll find out real quick that we've upgraded our playbook significantly. We've got submarines that can launch missiles from anywhere in the world. We've got stealth bombers that can hit any target on the planet within hours. We've got satellite networks that can see a dime on a sidewalk from space. And we've got a population that remembers Pearl Harbor just as clearly as they remember 9/11. So go ahead, Japan, test us, see what happens. Now, Japan's little apology baiting routine isn't new. They've been trying this for decades, and the most spectacular, beautiful, absolutely glorious crash and burn happened back in 2015 that year. Tokyo Broadcasting System, TBS, flew over a US scientist who had actually worked on the Manhattan Project, hoping to film him groveling in regret and apologizing on live television. And from the very second his plane touched down, it was a magnificent train wreck, one of the most satisfying things I've ever watched as an American. This guy was Harold Agnew, a bona fide Manhattan Project veteran. The real deal, he flew on the actual Hiroshima bombing mission, measured the blast radiation firsthand, and even filmed the mushroom cloud with his own camera. On top of that, he was a grad school classmate of Yang Chen-ning and Sung Dao Li at the University of Chicago, two Chinese physicists who later won Nobel Prizes. In the Japanese producer's Little Scheming Minds, Agnew was the perfect trophy, deep, undeniable involvement in the bombing, and a connection to Chinese scholars that they thought might make him more sympathetic to Asian suffering. They figured they could milk him for a tearful apology and broadcast it in August for the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They planned it like a military operation. Every camera angle, every emotional trigger, every sentimental setup, they brought in translators. They brought in survivors, they brought in museum guides, they pulled out all the stops, but they completely underestimated the man they were dealing with. They thought they were getting a frail old scientist who would fold under pressure. Instead, they got a stone-cold warrior who had zero interest in playing their game. A man who had spent his entire career dealing with facts, not feelings, a man who understood that war is hell, and that sometimes the only way to end hell is to make it even worse for the other side. But before his plane even finished taxiing, Agnew started trolling them, and I mean trolling at a master level, as the aircraft approached Hiroshima. A reporter leaned in and asked, "How does today's Hiroshima compare to back when you were here in 1945? Agnew casually looked out the window and said, "The weather's just as good as it was on the day I was here. Absolutely perfect visibility. You can see everything on the ground, nice and clear." The reporter's face probably froze. They landed, got into a car, and drove him straight to the AOI bridge, the actual aiming point of the bomb, and they kept asking him over and over how the streetscape looked different from before. I mean, come on, what did they expect him to say? The guy was probably thinking, well, it's different because I helped turn it into rubble. What do you want? A travelogue. Then they led him into the first carefully laid trap, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. Museum guides walked him through every grisly detail, buildings collapsing like card houses, nuclear radiation melting skin off bones. Survivors spending their entire lives crippled by after effects. They wanted shock and horror, they wanted tears, they wanted remorse, they wanted him to break down and say, "I'm so sorry for what we did," but Agnew showed zero sympathy, none whatsoever. Why would he? He knew exactly what his product could do. He designed the damn thing, tested it, deployed it. He understood its effects better than any museum docent ever could. He had studied the physics, he had calculated the yields, he had measured the fallout. He didn't need a museum to tell him what he already knew. Instead of staring mournfully at the photos of burned victims, he fixated on three specific things. First, the radiation monitors he personally built and dropped alongside the bomb, now sitting in glass cases like museum trophies, which he found oddly nostalgic. Second, his own original footage of the blast, which he proudly described to the reporters in technical detail, explaining how he framed the shot and what the readings showed. And third, various pieces of technical equipment that brought back fond memories of his wartime work. He was like a kid in a candy store, except the candy store was full of remnants of the destruction he had helped unleash, When it came time to sign the guest book, instead of the obligatory "I am so sorry" or "I feel deep regret" that the Japanese producers were desperately hoping for, Agnew wrote exactly one word, wonderful one word, to describe the aftermath of a nuclear attack on an enemy city. That is what we call a mic drop. That is what we call an absolute power move. The Japanese media, with absolutely no choice, had to translate it in the most anodyne way possible, calling it a very meaningful exhibition. Then a reporter pressed him. Having seen all this, what do you think about the women and children, the innocent civilians who died? Agnew cut him off and said, flatly, I know that in every war people start talking about innocence. But the Japanese back then, every one of them contributed to the war effort one way or another. They worked in factories, they supported the military, they cheered the conquests. So as far as I'm concerned, there was nobody truly innocent. Now, I personally think that's a bit too sweeping, because we do know that inside those Hiroshima and Nagasaki factories, there were 37 Chinese laborers kidnapped by the Imperial Army. 20 captured American pilots, our boys who were shot down and imprisoned, British and Dutch POWs, and roughly 50,000 Korean conscripts, all forced to work there. They didn't volunteer, they were enslaved, and they all died in that blast. So yes, there were innocent ghosts under that mushroom cloud. But Agnew wasn't in the mood for nuance that day. And honestly, after what had just been put through, I don't blame him one bit. The Japanese producers wanted a show, and he gave them a show. Just not the one they paid for. He gave them the unvarnished truth. And they couldn't handle it. The very next day, the Japanese crew set up what they thought was their ultimate weapon, a face-to-face meeting with 2 Hiroshima survivors. One old man claimed he was a middle school student at the time. The old lady said she was a streetcar driver. The implication was obvious. Look at these harmless civilians, surely you feel bad for them. But here's the twist they didn't see coming. That old guy, Nishino Shinobu, wasn't some random grandpa. He was a high-ranking official in the Tokyo Bomb Survivors Association, a known apologist who made his living downplaying Japan's war crimes. And the old lady, Fuji Akiko, a professional victim activist, traveling around the world to lecture everyone about how much Japan suffered, conveniently leaving out what Japan did to others. These two weren't innocent seniors, they were seasoned operatives trained in the art of emotional manipulation, trying to corner an old-school American scientist. And as an American watching this unfold, it made my blood boil, because it's the exact same playbook they've been running for decades. Cry victim. Deflect responsibility and try to guilt-trip Americans into apologizing for something we did to end a war they started. They didn't want dialogue, they wanted a confession, they didn't want understanding, they wanted submission, and they got neither. They got a lesson in history from someone who had actually lived it. The conversation started predictably. They described the horror of the explosion, their personal loss, their trauma, their lifelong hatred of nuclear weapons, all carefully crafted to lead to one conclusion. It was America's fault. Agnew listened, sighed, and replied with the patience of a man who had explained basic history 1,000 times before. Look, if that war hadn't ended when it did, American forces would have had to invade the Japanese mainland. And that would have meant far, far more casualties on both sides. You want to blame someone? Blame the Imperial Army that started the whole thing. Blame the generals who refused to surrender. Blame the leaders who dragged your country into a war you couldn't win. Blame the people who bombed Pearl Harbor without a declaration of war. Blame the people who tortured and killed POWs. Blame the people who committed atrocities across Asia. Because that's where the blame belongs, not on the country that finally stopped you. When the victim card totally flopped, they switched tactics to their favorite backup argument. The nukes are a uniquely evil claim. They insisted that nuclear weapons are in a category of their own, completely different from conventional bombs, and that Japan's suffering is unparalleled because it's the only country ever nuked. Agnew shot back immediately. And this is where he really turned the screws. A good friend of mine, a buddy I played baseball with, a guy I grew up with, a guy I knew since I was a kid, was killed fighting your army in the Pacific. Now, you tell me, to a dead man, does it make any difference whether he was killed by a bullet, a regular bomb, or an atomic bomb? Dead is dead. Dead doesn't care about categories. Dead doesn't care about uniqueness. Dead just cares that he's not coming home to his family. Dead just cares that he never got to see his kids grow up. Dead just cares that he died in some godforsaken jungle thousands of miles from home because your country decided to start a war it couldn't finish. Then he flipped the script entirely, compared to my friend and to the millions of other Americans and Allied soldiers who died defeating Japan. The two of you are the lucky ones because you actually survived. You got to live, you got to have families, you got to grow old, you got to sit here today and tell your story. My buddy didn't. He got a grave in a foreign country and a folded flag. So don't sit there and tell me about your suffering like it's somehow worse than his. Don't you dare compare your pain to the pain of the families who never got their sons back. The look on those two survivors' faces, I wish I had a screenshot, priceless, complete, and utter defeat. They had come prepared with tears and trauma, and they walked away with nothing but a lecture they didn't want to hear. But they weren't done yet. Through a translator, they asked directly after hearing our stories. Do you feel sorry for us? Agnew didn't even let the translator finish the sentence before cutting him off, visibly angry now. His voice rising, his face reddening. I don't feel sorry for you, not one bit, not a single ounce of sympathy. A lot of your people died in the blast, sure, but even more of my countrymen, including my own baseball buddy, died at Pearl Harbor because of your sneak attack. And you're asking me to apologize? Absolutely not. Not a chance, no way, never. I didn't start this war. Your leaders did. I didn't bomb Pearl Harbor. Your pilots did. I didn't torture POWs. Your military did. I didn't commit the rape of Nanking. Your soldiers did. So you want an apology? Look in the mirror. Look at your own history. Look at what your country did before we ever dropped a single bomb, and then tell me who should be apologizing to whom. Seeing the American Papa get genuinely furious, Nishino scrambled to backpedal again, saying, well, war is the fault of governments, not the people. Americans died too. We understand. But we also suffered terribly, so maybe just a little apology, just a small one for the cameras. For the sake of peace, Agnew pointed his finger straight at the old man's face, locked eyes with him, and said word for word, with absolute finality, with no room for negotiation. With the full weight of his 70-plus years of life behind every syllable, I will not apologize, not now, not ever. In fact, you owe me an apology, you owe every American veteran an apology, you owe every family who lost someone in the Pacific an apology. You owe every POW who was tortured in your camps an apology. And until you're ready to give that, don't ever ask me for anything again. Don't ever invite me to another memorial. Don't ever put me in front of another survivor. I've said my piece, and I'm done. And that was it. The meeting ended. The camera stopped rolling. The producers started panicking, and the Japanese crew was left with nothing but a pile of unusable footage and a whole lot of embarrassment. And let me tell you, as an American watching this from the outside, I felt nothing but pure satisfaction. That's how you handle revisionist history. That's how you handle victim baiting. That's how you stand your ground when someone tries to rewrite what happened. Harold Agnew didn't just win that exchange. He dominated it. He took everything they threw at him and threw it right back twice as hard. Now, fast forward to the present day, 2026. Japan's continuing obsession with the nuclear horror narrative isn't really about pacifism at all. It's a quiet, deliberate backdoor strategy for the Japanese right wing to push their own nuclear ambitions. And this is where it gets really interesting and really dangerous from an American perspective. Look at Sanai Takaichi, who refused to commit to the principle that Japan should never possess nuclear weapons. Or Shinjiro Koizumi, who openly said Japan should have no taboos in discussing nuclear weapons, which is political code for putting the entire nuclear option back on the table. But wait a second, didn't those same tearful survivors and the politicians who wrap themselves in their stories spend decades shouting that all nuclear weapons are evil and nuclear weapons should never exist? Didn't they build an entire national identity around being the sole victim of nuclear attack? Didn't they pass laws, sign treaties, and give speeches about how nuclear weapons are an abomination that must be eliminated from the face of the earth? And now, quietly, they're pushing to develop the very weapons they've been crying about. That's like spending your whole life denouncing drunk driving while secretly building a brewery in your basement. It's not just hypocrisy, it's a full-blown left brain versus right brain circus. One side of Japan wants to ban all nukes everywhere. The other side wants to build their own. And they're both using the same historical event to push completely opposite agendas. You can't have it both ways. Either the bomb was a unique evil that no one should ever possess, including you, or it's a legitimate tool of national defense that you're entitled to. Pick a lane, because right now you're trying to drive in both directions at once, and it's making you look ridiculous. And from an American standpoint, this is deeply concerning, because we have a treaty obligation to defend Japan if they're attacked. But we sure as hell didn't sign up to defend a nuclear-armed Japan that's rewriting history, playing victim at the same time, and actively undermining the non-proliferation regime that we've spent decades building. Think about it. We spent billions of dollars, decades of diplomacy, and countless man-hours convincing the world that nuclear weapons are too dangerous to spread. We signed treaties, we built inspection regimes, we threatened sanctions, we even went to war to prevent proliferation, and now Japan, one of our closest allies, is quietly hinting that maybe they should join the nuclear club. That's not just a betrayal of the global non-proliferation effort. It's a betrayal of the trust we've placed in them as a responsible partner. If Japan wants to go nuclear, they need to say it openly, and honestly, not hide behind survivor tears and pacifist slogans while their right-wing politicians quietly lay the groundwork. That's not just dishonest, it's dangerous. It undermines trust, it destabilizes the region. It triggers an arms race with China and South Korea, it alienates their own pacifist population, and it puts American lives at risk if things go sideways. Because if Japan starts developing nukes, you can bet your bottom dollar that China will accelerate its own program, North Korea will go ballistic, literally. And the entire region will spiral into a new Cold War. And guess who gets caught in the middle? Us, our bases, our troops, our allies, our interests, all because Japan couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a victim or a victor. So here's my radical, no-holds-barred proposal to Japan. You've got the weepy pacifists on one side and the whiny militarists on the other. You've got people who want to ban nuclear weapons and people who want to build them. You've got people who blame America for everything and people who want to be America's best ally. You've got people who can't stop talking about Hiroshima and people who can't stop talking about Pearl Harbor. Figure it out, because right now you look like a country that can't decide whether it wants to be a victim, a victor, or a villain. And that indecision is costing you credibility with the one ally you actually need. You want to be a pacifist nation, great. Then commit to it, no nukes, no revisionism, no excuses. You want to be a normal military power, fine, then own it. Drop the victim complex, admit your history, and build a defense policy that doesn't rely on emotional blackmail. But you can't do both. You can't cry about the bomb while secretly building one. You can't demand apologies while refusing to give them. You can't preach peace while planning for war. So here's what I say. Settle this the old-fashioned way, a samurai duel, one-on-one, to the death. Winner takes all, loser takes the blame. And we all sit back and watch deal, all right? That's it for today. Smash that like button. Drop your comments below. I want to hear what you think. And I'll see you in the next one. Stay sharp, stay skeptical, and never let anyone rewrite history for you. Later.